All right, thank you very much. Now, I'm going to speak today about the use of antimicrobials in India's livestock sector, and I get to follow on from Dr. Bhatia's very excellent talk yesterday and Professor Jeffries, both of whom have somewhat stolen my thunder, but I'm going to argue that the use and abuse of antibiotics in the livestock sector is really a tale of two challenges. And it relates to first, changing the regulatory environment, as we heard very eloquently, and second, changing farmer behavior. And I think it has to go in that order. So, we know that there are three primary ways that humans can be exposed to resistant bacteria from livestock sources, but as it was mentioned yesterday, we don't know the relative importance of these pathways. So in 2011, India had 273 million agricultural workers, people who are classified as farmers or agricultural workers. So this is really a significant proportion of people who can bring animal source resistance back into their communities. So, and I think what we're really going to find out is the environment is Pandora's box. We're really only now uncovering the ways that residues and resistomes can get into the environment from agriculture and industrial activities, and we know that environmental contamination is as much of a problem in the global north as it is in the global south. And a very good example, for example, in 2016, the state of Florida in the US declared emergency and then went on to spray, I think it was 2.3 million tons of antibiotics on orange trees to stop greening disease. And I've recently learned that antibiotics are actually sprayed into oil pipelines to stop bacterial overgrowth. So these things are starting to emerge. It's not just the livestock sector. It's not just the human sector. We really have to control all of this. Now, clearly, animals produce waste, and waste is an environmental pollutant. And when we look at the numbers of livestock in India, and what I want you to do when you see this, I want you to look at this and think, that is an awful lot of animal waste. But I think there's some other interesting things at these numbers. I think this is census data from 2012, and what it indicates is the overall numbers of livestock are declining, while the poultry industry, as we discussed yesterday, is really rapidly expanding. And I think we'll see further declines in the ruminant population as climate change really starts to hit. It's already having an impact on the livestock sector. We know that heat stress in dairy cows is a real problem for the subsistence sector. And there's some very, very alarming predictions about the amount of ground source water that will be left in India by 2050, which some people think will be zero. Some people think they'll have run out of water. So what is the predicted rise of antibiotic use in animal agriculture? Now, this is published information from the resistance map, and that was published by the Center for Disease Dynamics, Economics, and Policy. It's an environmental NGO, and they estimated the use of antibiotics across all livestock sectors will increase by 18% to 2030. Now, here's the rub. This figure doesn't look too bad. I mean, the UK is at 39 micrograms per PCU. France is at 41 micrograms per PCU. So I think that these types of figures are interesting and they're valuable, but they're not particularly helpful in terms of shaping national policy. And I think this is largely because of, first, the drugs that farmers are actually using. And we heard a lot yesterday about the 2018, the Hindu Times expose about colistin and Venky's chickens. But equally, they hide this underlying structure of the livestock sector and the livestock industry. And this is also likely to inform future use. So, for example, while there's this really rapidly expanding commercial poultry sector, in my opinion anyway, I think we'll see this rapidly declining small-scale dairy sector under conditions of climate change. Now, what happens to the dairy sector under conditions of climate change really is anybody's guess. The current trend in India is for climate control. So it's for air-conditioned dairy barns. Now, so essentially production levels are being protected at all cost. So the question becomes, is this level of intensification going to lead to greater use of antibiotics? Well, of course, in the short term, yes. But in the longer term, would under a stricter regulatory environment, this could prove like a boon to biosecurity. We simply don't know how this is going to play out. So I think it's very difficult to make accurate predictions about the use of antibiotics in the livestock industry without understanding how different drivers, in addition to consumption, are also changing production. But more evidence is regarding antibiotic resistance and residue in the poultry sector, which leads us back to use. Now, this was a study undertaken in 2014 by the Center for Science and the Environment, and they explored antibiotic residues in food outlets around New Delhi. Now, 40% of the restaurants contained residues of one or more antibiotics, and what was really interesting about this study is they really named and shamed the different restaurants involved. But of course, the criticisms leveled against this was, well, residues do not equal resistance, but it was this study that really sparked off, I think, this national debate on meat safety in India. Now, in 2017, there was another study, big study by another NGO in the Punjab, and here they found that 87% of the broiler farms tested positive for ESBL-producing bacteria. All of the poultry farms used antimicrobials. Half of the poultry farms used them as growth promotion. Farms that used growth promoters were 2.1%, twice as likely to have resistant bacteria. But the study raised a lot of additional points that weren't really picked up by the press. And the first was in relation to transport. There's no cold chain for poultry in India, so what was happening is a bird might be raised in one state, it might be shipped over state lines to be processed, and before that bird leaves the farm, they're pumped up with antibiotics because it's perceived that this will keep them alive for longer. Now, these antibiotics clearly get into the food chain. The other big issue that that came out of the study, and this is certainly one of the areas of my own work, is many of the agricultural workers had very low levels of education, and the farmers were basically saying it's easier to give the birds antibiotics than to leave them with this unsupervised labor to adhere to biosecurity practices. So poor management plus poor hygiene equals greater use of antibiotics. Now, the contract farmers, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, they were often given feed premixed with growth promoters, and they really didn't know what they were feeding their chickens. But what this contract farming system does is it spreads this nidus of resistance out over the community. Now, along with the other environmental contaminants of the poultry industry. Now, most poultry are housed on something which terms poultry litter, and which in India can be sawdust or cereal straw, and poultry litter is subsequently used as a fertilizer. Now, what's in this litter? Well, it turns out there's actually quite a lot. There's metals such as arsenic, copper, iron, selenium, and zinc, and these are often added to poultry feed for weight gain. Now, we know that heavy metals are a big problem in AMR, and what happens is studies have shown that the level of metals in poultry feed are concentrated at least 2 to 3 times by the time they go through the bird and end up in the litter. There's also a lot of dead birds in this litter, and it either gets composted or these birds get ground up. Now, once this litter is applied to agricultural land, we know the variety of studies have shown that after rain, the runoff contains high levels of everything that's in there, from bacteria to the metals to antibiotics. Residues in these leach into the waterways. And we know that there's also been studies that show that E. coli can continue to leach from the soil for up to 2 months after a single rain event. Now, this is, I found this fascinating. Another pollutant of the poultry industry, which really hasn't been raised anywhere, is dust in these poultry farms. Apparently, dust from these poultry farms is this really complex mixture of organic and inorganic particles, from feed to litter to feathers to dander mites to bacteria to fungi. I mean, it's pretty much got everything in there. So we don't really know anything about this dust and what happens to it. But what's interesting about India is poor biosecurity in the poultry sector is not a given. India exports poultry to nearly 50 countries. Now, the largest share of trade is with Oman, but Europe imports about 5,000 metric tons of chicken from India. And mainly it's the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany. Now, while the Export Inspection Council of India follows EU regulations regarding residues for the export of chicken, domestic regulations for antibiotic use are much less clear. Now, the laws relating to withdrawal periods are quite clear. And they are, and as we know, there's a withdrawal period about 7 days for milk and eggs and 28 days for meat. But when you go down to the ground, there's very little understanding of this. Now, for example, in 2012, we were involved in the study of mastitis in Maharashtra, and what we found was only a very small minority of farmers were observing milk with withdrawal times, and most of the farmers would sell on the milk unless the visual quality was so bad that it would be turned back at the local milk cooperative. Now, last year we did a follow-up study with some of these farmers, and we were exploring the attitudes and behaviors towards antibiotic use. And what we found was that few of the farmers believed that antibiotics could adulterate the milk, despite the most common treatment being the intramammary infusion of antibiotics for mastitis. And the responses were more mixed when farmers were asked if the milk was safe to drink, if antibiotics actually did get into the milk. So nearly a third thought it was safe, but a critical problem in mastitis in India is it's increasingly becoming multi-drug resistant. And this is a very small study on a research farm in Maharashtra, where the levels of mastitis and subclinical mastitis were very low, at about 1 and 3%. So hygiene is very good. But the researcher found that the levels of resistance to critical antibiotics was really high. So why am I presenting on this very small study? It tells us two things. It says, first, good biosecurity is not going to save us. It's not going to get us out of this problem immediately. And the second thing about this study is, off the research farm, we have to think what's going to be going on. Well, farmers will be using more and more drugs to treat the same infection, higher levels of residue in the milk, et cetera, and the cascade of resistance moves on. But we have almost done. We have very little data on antibiotic use in dairy farms in India, and that's for a number of reasons. There's few written records, access to veterinary services in some areas is very low. These are all things, there's social reasons that we know that that farmers often feel they can't access veterinary services. Sometimes they claim that they're seeing a doctor, and it might be just a knowledgeable person in the community. So we desperately need to start unpacking the complexity of AMR use in animal agriculture, and we have to start taking into account the social, economic, and environmental drivers in addition to the demand for meat and milk. And I think in order to depoliticize this health crisis in India, it's exactly this wider evidence base that we need to present to decision makers. And I think in doing so, we really need much more, we need new and more sophisticated decision support tools. So, of course, all presentations on AMR generally begin or end with Fleming, so I'm going to end on him. And I think this is where I think he got it wrong. I don't think it's the ignorant man who has brought this problem to the world. I think it's the educated man. I don't think there's one veterinarian, there's not one medical scientist, there's not one microbiologist, there's not one allied professional in the last 50 years who hasn't been trained in resistance. So what's happened, and how did we let this happen? Thanks very much.